Ça me fait plaisir de vous accueillir ici à Montréal pour le séminaire de Dor ABRAHAMSON de l'Université de Californie à Berkeley. Je vais vous dire quelques mots à propos de lui. Il est professeur à la Graduate School of Education de l'Université de Californie à Berkeley. Il a un laboratoire de recherche sur le design incorporé. Il va vous expliquer ce que c'est que incorporé tout à l'heure, embodiment, consacré aux technologies pédagogiques pour l'enseignement de l'apprentissage des mathématiques en particulier. Il s'intéresse particulièrement aux relations entre l'apprentissage, une nouvelle façon de mouvement, et l'apprentissage de concepts mathématiques. Donc, carrément sensorimoteur ou perceptuomotor, comme il le dit. Ces recherches appuient sur la cognition incarnée, embodied, la théorie des systèmes dynamiques, tout ce qui se remue est dynamique par définition, et la théorie socio-culturelle, ça va venir à la fin. Il parle français, mais il n'a pas l'habitude de présenter en français, mais peux-tu répondre aux questions en français? Si on te pose une question en français, tu peux répondre?
Oui, je pense que ça pourrait marcher.
Ok. Alors, la présentation s'appelle
Enactivist symbol grounding.
C'est un défi de te traduire ça. From attentional anchors, mon Dieu, into mathematical discourse. Voilà, alors,
merci bien, mon Dieu aussi. Alors, all right, thank you, Stefan. Can you hear me? Is that working? You can hear me?
Okay. In the class, they hear you.
Okay, wonderful.
Marche pour en ligne.
Is there a thumb up? People can hear me online? I just cannot see the people right now.
Ça marche très bien.
Très bien. Alors, okay, merci bien. Alors, my training is in cognitive psychology and the design of educational technologies. And my PhD is in a field called the learning sciences, which is the cognitive science research on human learning and teaching of skills and concepts. Yes, so I might be the odd person out in the seminar series because I will not be talking about LLM or AI, even as I will be talking about symbol grounding, explicitly so. What this grounding is, what it looks like, literally, perception as symbol grounding, at least for mathematical cognition. That is, I ask, what does it actually mean to ground a mathematical concept? And if we can figure that out, how, therefore, should we engineer this grounding? That is, as an educational endeavor for people to learn some concept. Perhaps that's the most important question currently for cognitive scientists with an interest in mathematics education. I will be claiming that one way of fostering mathematical symbol grounding is first to take care of the grounding, at least first to create conditions where students develop some new perceptuomotor capacity, a new perceptual capacity for dynamic motor control of the environment, which the educators have engineered as the embodied and active instantiation of the mathematical concept in question. And only later do we lead the students to use various standard frames of reference and instruments from the mathematics discipline to formalize this new perceptuomotor capacity, so that finally a set of symbols can have meaning as referring to and evoking this new perceptuomotor capacity that as such grounds the symbols. Much of this talk will be about a cognitively critical event in this development of new perceptuomotor capacity, namely the moment when a student comes to perceive in the environment latent structures, affordances, I guess ecological psychologists might say, that enable a better grip, a better control. I will call these perceptual structures that enable a better grip or control, I'll call them attentional anchors, which you see in the title. It's a phrase that I borrowed from Dan Hutto and Raul Sanchez Garcia. All going well, you yourselves will each have a chance of experiencing firsthand the ecological power of attentional anchors. I said firsthand, but should probably say first hands, plural, because the action will be bimanual. So here we go. I'm speaking to you from Berkeley. The sun is just rising here, I guess. This is a view towards San Francisco. And if you look carefully, you will not be able to see me because I'm just there to the right. So I'm just off the picture. So I want to talk about meaning, okay? A talk about symbol grounding is a talk about meaning. So meaning, what is meaning anyway? What is the meaning of meaning? I'd like to begin this talk on symbol grounding by speaking of the state of the nation, the mathematical state of the nation, which is a state of ungrounded symbols. As long as we think of the human mind as a type of computational device, we will not be bothering to ground those symbols, because doing so will not seem an important project. And so, in a sense, the grim mathematical state of the nation, the deep state of emergency, is an epistemological crisis. The crisis of mathematics education is that of meaningless procedures. And we will overcome this crisis only through modeling mathematics education on a different epistemological grounding. So let me tell you a story to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So I talk about meaning, but actually the absence of meaning. And this is a phrase, I wonder where it comes from, sounds Shakespearean, but in any case used by a senior colleague called Pat Thompson, a professor of mathematics education. And this is from I was going to say recent, but the years are passing, right? It's 10 years now. A chapter from Leatham's book, Vital Directions for Mathematics Education Research, where Pat is telling this story. This chapter is kind of a reflection looking back to his work in the 70s, 80s, 90s. But he tells a story of coming into a classroom and asking a teacher, "What are you studying?" And the teacher says, "Oh, we're studying angles." "Okay, well, what are you doing?" He says, "Okay, go and look at that kid. She's my best student and, working on angles." Okay, so he goes and asks the kid, "So what are you doing?" "Oh," she says, "we're working on angles." And he says, "Very well, what is an angle?" And she says, "Oh, so here's the angle, and I put my protractor, and then I get 40. And he says, "Very well, and 40 what?" She says, 40 degrees. He says, "Well, what is a degree?" "Well, that's how we count angles." "Yes, but what is an angle?" "Oh, that's what we count with this thing where you put the protractor and you get 40. So this goes round, and he never gets at any sense of, well, the 40 means that it's 40 out of, say, 360, so that when we say 40, we're talking about that it's 1/9 open, that we're actually speaking here about the aperture, that it's 1/9 open, and that is what the angle is, that 360 is arbitrary number, and 40, therefore, should be 40 out of 3. So there's no sense of what an angle is. And so during recess, he goes to the teacher's hall and has more or less the same conversation with the teacher, who says, yes, they need to know how to measure and make sure the protractor is there, and it's that one, and not to look at that other number because it's 40. And yes, but what is an angle? So it's what you measure. So he goes round and never actually gets to any sense of, well, what is this thing? This symbol. Well, what is it referring to? What is it about? What is it in the world? What is something sensorimotor that might ground this? So he's talking about the absence of meaning. And he says, well, more broadly, we expect students to learn just by translating across all kinds of symbols. For example, you have this statement here. Well, what does it mean? Oh, here, this is what it means. Just translate it to a table and you'll know. Or just translate it to a linear graph on the Cartesian system, and then you'll know what it is. So there's been the sense that the knowledge, mathematical knowledge, is the capacity to translate across different semiotic registers what is essentially carrying the same meaning. But that maybe this is something we need to rethink. Maybe meaning is not residing just in the translating across here. And so for those who know, right, symbol grounding, the very idea, you can see how those ideas are so vital, eminent, and important for mathematics education. Because, as a friend once said, it seems very pretty, but it's rather hard to understand. Somewhat it seems to fill my head with ideas, only I don't exactly know what they are. So what is mathematics? What are these symbols? Pat Thompson says, well, this is now upon reflection. He says, tables, graphs, and expressions might be multiple representations of functions to us, right? The mathematically informed adults. But he says, I've seen no evidence that they are representations of anything to students. Okay, so we call them representations, but that word is actually it's void of any mental content, because it's not really representing anything. We should focus on these things, tables, graphs, etc., as representations of something that, from the student's perspective, is representable. All right, something, such as some aspect of a specific situation. Okay, so he's looking for some kind of situation that is, if you will, beneath or around or other than those symbols. And his take is, the key issue then becomes twofold: to find situations that are sufficiently propitious for engendering multitudes of representational activity, all right, and orient students to draw connections among their representational activities in regard to the situation that engendered them. So he's basically saying we need to ground these symbols, okay? So we're looking for something that is representable, and we need to find situations that are sufficiently propitious for engendering multitudes of representational activity. So some might say that Pat is reinventing Piaget here, but it goes back further. It goes back to people like this. This is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And in his book Emile, or On Education, in chapter 3, the pedagogue of Emile says, what is the use of all these symbols? Why not begin by showing him, that's Emile, the child, the real thing, so that he may at least know what you're talking about? And as a general rule, never substitute the symbol for the thing that is signified, unless it is impossible to show the thing itself. For the child's attention is so taken up with the symbol that he will forget what it signifies. Okay? So what is the real thing, though, right? The real thing. Now, if you were studying, say, magnetism, science, it probably behooves us to have, well, a magnet there that would help kids understand what magnetism is. It stands to reason. You want to bring a magnet into the classroom so they feel the attraction and repulsion. If you're studying botany, maybe bring in flowers. You can observe, you can smell, right? You can investigate. If you're studying weather, well, you might want to know about thunder and lightning, etc., and so on. Maybe studying, zoology, you might want to have a friendly mammal you can get to know and get to understand. But what is the real thing in mathematics? How should we even think about it? What is a situation in mathematics such that it can ground all these symbols, at least prospectively ground those symbols that are about to come? Well, this takes us a few years further. If Rousseau lived till 78, a few years later, 4 years later, this good-looking gentleman joined our world. This is Friedrich Froebel, and if you haven't heard of him, well, he's probably had a bigger impact on your life than you know, because Froebel invented something that we all love and cherish and send our kids to. He invented kindergarten. Until then, there was no such thing. And Friedrich Froebel was, I'm sure there's always precedence to these things, but he's considered like a milestone in education, in that he is the one who created this regimen of what we might call today manipulatives. All these objects, he actually called them gifts. Every gift 1, gift 2, gift 3, and which were to be used within education in very specific ways, which he thought out and communicated. So the gift 1 was this kind of yarn ball, and this yarn ball, he prescribed different ways to use it. So it's really a pedagogical regimen that is completely based on a set of manipulatives, gift 1, gift 2, gift 3, I think it goes through gift 19, which children were to interact with in order to develop mentally and conceptually. And we know of, over the years, other kinds of manipulatives coming from Fribble, well, from people like Maria Montessori and Hans Freudenthal, Caleb Gattegno, Zoltan Dien, Simo Papert, all kind of names that if you're outside of them, the world of mathematics, education, research, you might be kind of raising your eyebrow, like, who's Freudenthal? Who's Gattegno? But you may very well have studied with their own manipulatives. And of course, the digital era comes along, so we have things like GeoGebra and Tinkerplots and NetLogo and PhET and graspable math and Desmos, etc. And I keep on asking, yes, but to what extent is this enabling us to ground the mathematical concept in our sensorimotor system? And I think I just saw earlier on that Art joined us. So hi, Art. You have a cameo here in my slides. Here we go. So I'd like to paraphrase words from Art Glenberg in 2006, and we see Stefan's name here as well, a paper, Radical Changes in Cognitive Processes Due to Technology. He has this jaundiced commentary in which he says, and I quote, he says, this is kind of at the end, he's like criticizing all these technologies that have been presented in the special issue. Says, one can see most of my reasons for skepticism as challenges for the future development of technology that is sensitive to the principles of biological cognitive systems. Right, Art? I guess you still hold to these ideas. And I find that inspiring because it's asking us, well, what might be this technology that is sensitive to the principles of biological cognitive systems? And I guess one should first say, well, what are the principles of biological cognitive systems such that the technology can be sensitive thereof? So we're talking about designing technology for learning, which is what I do. I'm a design-based researcher of mathematical technology, interactive technologies for children to learn targeted concepts. And I come from the learning sciences, and I try to bring together the cognitive sciences writ large to include sociocultural theory, dynamic systems theory, in order to inform the development of interactive technologies through which children will develop new sensory motor abilities, well, perceptuomotor capacity. And only once they do that do I try to move that towards symbols so that those symbols will have meaning, okay? So the project is for symbol grounding by first creating these technologies sensitive to principal biological cognitive systems, and only later to language them, so to speak, to bring them into a new semiotic register so that these symbols have meaning. So, well, let's see where this takes us. When we talk about symbols, symbol grounding, we notice that all these folks like Thompson and Rousseau and Froebel and Montessori, Freudenthal, Gattegno, Zoltan Dien, Skem, Simo Papert, they're all talking about starting from kind of situation. And I asked earlier, well, what might be a situation in mathematics, given that it's less tangible than a giraffe or anything of that sort? And let's take some example, right? Okay, so 5 times 2 equals 2 times that. You could just tell the child whenever you see these kinds of the situation, like something x something, just flip it and you'll get an equation, right? But we probably feel that's not quite the way to begin, right? So what if we start with something like this? Here are 10 blue balls and we can parse them differently. This is beginning to get towards something that maybe Art would approve of, but probably still skeptical. So let's get to something a bit more tangible. So I'm assuming you're all familiar with this work from Stefan here, Harnad, the symbol grounding problem. But just to really just sketch it out, we're asking where are the meanings of symbols. The meanings of symbols are not intrinsic to the symbol system itself. There has to be some entity outside of the symbol system that makes sense of the symbols. So, and again, if somebody's watching this later who doesn't know this idea, consider instead of China, I'm thinking of Mongolia, because so many of my audience are from China often. So Ulaanbaatar National Airport, you arrive there, you land, you're looking for your luggage, you're looking around, there are signs, all the signs are in Mongolian. You say, well, you don't understand. Well, but luckily there's this receptionist kind of looking desk, looking very friendly people. So you come up to them, they look like they help you, and they say, they nod and they give you a dictionary, and you say, oh, thank you so much. You look at that word, you flip, 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 eventually you find it, and you say, okay, let's look what it means. But to your great dismay, you see that rather than translating to English, it's just giving the definition in more Mongolian. So you say, okay, I can still wing this. You look at the definition, finding words, and look for those words in the dictionary, which give it more and more Mongolian. So you find yourself just like those kids with the table and the graph and the equation going round and round in circles, translating from one to the other without carrying any meaning, without grounding, still you don't know where your luggage is, okay? So to be grounded, the symbol system would have to be augmented with sensorimotor capacities, okay? So we are the system. The capacity to interact autonomously with the world of objects, events, properties, and states that its symbols refer to. So how can we do that? So this is what the talk is about, right? How can we ground all of these mathematical symbols? And as I said, I want to begin, suspend those symbols, begin from the body's interaction in the world, begin from sensory motor capacities, give opportunities for children to develop new sensory motor capacities, and only then to signify those with the symbols. So, right, because, yeah, last time I looked, let me check this box. Yeah. So here's already getting a bit closer to 5 times 2. Here's my kid, Naomi. She's now in college. She's over at Oberlin. But here I'm talking to her at 5 times 2 equals 2 times 5. You can try doing this at home. Here's 5 and 5. So we're moving between these kind of 2. So this is me searching with Naomi's help for ways to ground mathematics. But this is just the beginning. As Gilbert Ryle said whimsically, rules, like birds, yeah, these rules, must live before they can be stuffed. Yeah, he had an interesting humor. And of course, if I show one child doing mathematic things, I have to show the other. I wonder if you've ever seen this. Yeah, model that. Okay. So we're looking for educational interventions that could foster a grounded understanding of mathematical concepts. And we acknowledge that we need somehow for students to engage in sensory motor activity that would offer a sense of the real thing, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau said. I'd like to step back for a moment just to situate this line of work within a bigger picture of how the cognitive sciences are considering a new paradigm, embodiment, that is elevating the role of sensory motor activity as the evolutionary, neural, and phenomenological a priori of symbolic activity. So consider Kitty here. And I always find it amusing that many people find this funny, but when I ask them why is it funny, they realize that the joke is on us, because many of us think this way. I think of it as the good old-fashioned artificial intelligence cat, assuming that the cat is actually doing these calculations in its head, when probably it's not. And I guess this is coming up in this seminar series. We know from more and more fields, like from philosophy, psycholinguistics, cognitive psychology, anthropology, and from dynamic systems theory, and even from robotics, that Kitty need not be doing these kinds of calculations in its head. And in fact, Kitty can do well without any of these calculations at all. And you asked me earlier, Stefan, if this is empirical. So here we go. N equals 1. You see. Yeah. So doing stuff is not necessarily what you think. It's not necessarily that kind of computational processes going on in the mind, and we have ecological ways of solving problems of interacting with the environment. Classically, the baseball outfielder problem that many have spoken of, like Macbeth et al., and most recently Gerrit Gigerenzer. This is a classical example that I enjoy. I didn't grow up on baseball, grew up on other sports, but how does a baseball player do this, right? The ball is coming from behind them, and they need to figure out where it will land. So they look back now, according to a computational model, right? They're thinking, okay, the ball is there. Let me do some calculations. Wait, ball, I'm still calculating. Getting through, almost there. Got it. Okay, now I know where to go, and thus catches the ball, right? But according to alternative ways of thinking, what we're doing is something that is ecologically coupled, because we look to see where the ball is, and this is, sorry, my PowerPoint limitations, but then what we do is we look forward. So this is the ball up there. We are running forward even as the ball is also going forward, but seemingly the ball needs to stay on a straight line relative to us. So even as we are moving forward, the ball relatively is coming towards us. That is our experience. And if the ball falls under this line, we need to hurry up. If it goes above the line, we need to slow down. So this is the ecological explanation for how we catch a baseball. No calculation a priori needed, rather dynamically and ecologically coupled between keeping certain perceptual structures stable so as to accomplish this environmentally coupled task. And so then you might say, well, okay, that's all very well, Professor Abramson, but we're talking here about math, and certainly that must be exalted, transcended, abstract. How in the world could all of this baseball crap have anything to do with math? And I think, well, you know, there's just one brain. It's not like we have a special little math lobe anywhere. Is there anywhere in the world, that we can think of these things related? And this is a math education guy, Richard Skem, says, mathematics, like music, needs to be expressed in physical actions and human interactions before its symbols can evoke the silent patterns of mathematical ideas. How do we do that? So maybe we shouldn't start from these things. Maybe we should go one step back and to the meanings of all of these symbols before they will ground those perceptuomotor capacities. And again, the 20th century prevalent kind of epistemological view on the human mind is that we get information from the senses, from touch and taste and smell and sight and sound, and then all of that goes through this membrane, becomes amodal, it's processed as prepositions, as abstract symbols. We get these inferences and then go back into the terrestrial embodied world where we act. But this is being questioned, and the embodied paradigm, embodiment, now thought of embodied and embedded, ecological, extended, enacted, etc., is thinking, well, perhaps all thinking is always modal. It is never amodal, so that it's all happening at the same time. Okay, it is all happening in a modal sense, that all thinking is necessarily sensory motor simulation, and the premotor cortex, motor cortex, is always firing even as you're thinking about anything at all. Now, before you ask me, wait, how do mathematicians think? Well, here is Terence Tao, considered by many the leading mathematician of our generation. At the age of 24, he became full professor, which I find as a personal affront. He is at UCLA. And he's very generous in sharing his ways of thinking about mathematics. And he says, for example, for evolutionary partial differential equations in particular, and I'm quoting him, I find there's a rich zoo of colorful physical analogies that one can use to get a grip on a problem. I've used the metaphor of an egg yolk frying in a pool of oil or a jet ski riding ocean waves to understand the behavior of a fine-scaled or high-frequency component of a wave when under the influence of a lower frequency field, and how it exchanges mass, energy, or momentum with its environment. And he says, in one extreme case, I ended up rolling around on the floor with my eyes closed in order to understand the effect of a gauge transformation that was based on this type of interaction between different frequencies. He goes on to say that he didn't put that rolling on the floor description in his book, but it did win him a Booker Prize. And we have similar testimonies from going back to 1945, the book by Jacques Hadamard, who's has testimonies from people like Albert Einstein and Henri Poincaré and others talking about this imagistic, full-bodied, immersive way of thinking and solving problems through these full, immersive, imagistic experiences, and only later trying to sort out how to articulate that in symbols. So where does this capacity even come from? Well, consider the black heron. It has wings and it flies with the wings, and yet it uses its wings for other things as well. It uses its wings for something called, for example, canopy fishing, in which it makes shade over the water in order to see the fish better so it can hunt them. So this is what Stephen Gould called acceptation. We have this earlier capacity, this earlier character, biological character, the wings and the capacity to manipulate them, that is later used for something completely different, which promotes our adaptation to our ecology. And acceptation, species biological characters evolved for other usages and later co-opted for their current role. And I believe that mathematics is doing the same kind of thing. Doing mathematics, it co-opts our capacity of perception for action. Whenever we think mathematically, what we're doing is we're trying to get a grip on the world, even if the world is not material, but that is the way our mind works. Our embodied, enacted mind is always trying to get a grip on the world, even if it's imaginary things. And all mathematical insights are the development of new perceptions for action. You can read about it more over here. I have one slide, which is kind of my theory slide, and it's a bit of a toughie, but we'll get through it. And then all the rest will be just, okay, so how do I use this stuff? My work is heavily grounded in the enactivist philosophy of Varela and others. In a nutshell, the enactive approach consists of 2 points. First one is pretty easy. Perception consists in perceptually guided action. The idea is that prehistorically, whenever we had the capacity to gain information about the world, it was in order to inform our motorics in the world, in order to inform our interaction, coming towards things or avoiding things. So whenever we think about perceiving the world, latent to that or imminent in that is that we are perceiving in order to act upon the world. But this is a more tough one. Cognitive structures, eventually what underlying conceptual understandings, they emerge from the recurrent sensorimotor patterns, like our exploratory sensorimotor patterns, that enable action to be perceptually guided. All right, so our actions are always perceptually guided, but when we need to learn new perceptually guided actions, when we, for example, need to learn how to hold a ball, that comes from recurrent sensorimotor patterns. If you look at babies trying to grip things, try until something works. A certain sensorimotor pattern, if that one will work, the recurrent sensorimotor pattern is working, it's enabling action to be perceptually guided. Therefore, it will the residue of all this trying will be new cognitive structures. As a design-based researcher of mathematics education, I always ask myself, okay, there are new cognitive structures, new mathematical concepts that I want children to learn. Therefore, what will be the sensorimotor patterns? What will be the activity that I create so that some kind of action will be perceptually guided? This should become clearer, I hope, through the demonstration. I work in an approach called design-based research, conjecture-driven, iterative, empirical studies, wherein theory and design coincide. So we always begin from some kind of design problem. For example, children are not understanding proportion, some mathematical concept. We draw on theories in order to build interactive technologies for children to learn the concept. We try them out, things don't work, but it's because the theory was inadequate. We update the theory, try things out again, and with time making better theory and better design. So that means that my empirical cognitive science work is vested within the educational design practice, all right? These cycles of theory, design, and onwards are the place within which I do my cognitive science work. And sometimes we resort to technologies only when necessary. So what might this kind of embodied and active work look like when we're actually trying to create things for children to learn? So in search of an embodied design for, say, proportional equivalence, all right? How can kids learn proportion? How can we create the real thing, as Rousseau would say? Some kind of situation, some sensorimotor activity, so that the symbols of proportion will have meaning. So we're looking for prospective grounding of mathematical ideas by creating new perception for action. So here's our first attempt. So Mark is cranking the pulleys there, and Becky is holding on. But you see the pulleys have different diameters. They relate by a ratio of 2/3, and therefore Becky's hands are going up and down at a ratio of 2/3. So this was our very, very first mechanism, just a mechanical device to try and wrap our head around, like, what are we even talking about? And it was really helpful for us because we then understood what's not working here. What's not working is that although Becky's hands are moving at a 2/3 ratio, she doesn't really have any task here. She's just holding on and things are happening to her. No efferent action going on here. She doesn't try anything. She doesn't fail anything. She doesn't confront. So we asked, well, can we make this better? So introduced interactive technologies. What's happening here is there's a remote control. This hand is controlling this cursor, and the left hand, the right hand controlling this cursor. It's a Nintendo Wii system. And you will see, as I show, the same kind of design architecture where you're moving two cursors up and down. We've created it in using all different kinds of interactive technologies. The point here is not so much is it remote, or is it the fingers on, or is it the tabletop, etc. More the issue is what is happening, how are children trying to figure these things out. So they need to make this screen green, and it's green only in this case when this object, this distance, say 10-inch, and this maybe 20-inch. So this height, say 10, and this 20, the two heights are related by a particular ratio. In this case, this one is double as much as that, which is why the screen is green. So we bring kids into a room and show them a screen. The screen is red. We're asking them, can you manipulate, and you might want to look at my hands also here if you can see on the screen, manipulate the screen so that it will be green. So children try moving one cursor up and down, it's red, the other one it's red, both of them it's red, both of them real fast, it's still red. They flail their hands and suddenly it is green. Why is it green? Because it just so happens we set things up so that this height, when this height is double that one, things are green. Otherwise they remain red. So now we ask kid, can you move your hands keeping the thing green? And what happens is kids, all they know at this point, because they haven't yet developed a new proportional perception for action, they look at the distance between their hands and they raise that. And so if you look at the vertical or the diagonal difference between the hands, they keep that constant, and so it remains red. And then they try again and it goes red, and they fix it back to green, and again they fix it. And with time they say to me, oh, wait a moment, as my hands go up, the more they go up, the bigger the distance needs to be between them. And for us, this is small step for man, a giant step for man. Well, how does it go? Because they're looking at this new thing which they hadn't yet been looking at, which is the distance between the hand, and now realizing that this distance is going to change as the hands go up. So this little negative space that now is now foregrounded as a thing that they are relating to and using in order to orchestrate this bimanual coordination. It's very difficult to move up and down the hands moving at different speeds, but the moment you shift your attention between the hands to a thing that is there, and later we'll see that in the eye tracking, the moment you look here, then you are able to control this much better, because this thing can be greater or smaller, can change its elevation, or we can correlate the elevation and size. The higher it goes, the bigger it is. But in so doing, a new ontology is born, and we call this the attentional anchor. It anchors your attention. You are now able to move in this way. You now have a new perception for action. So this is what I meant. You have a new cognitive structure that is enabling your action to be perceptually guided. Remember those slides about enactivism, right? New cognitive structures emerge from the recurrent sensorimotor patterns that are enabling action to be perceptually guided. And what I'll speak about less is the point where we start bringing in, now we bring in the cavalry, bring in the symbols, bring in the cultural symbolic artifacts, and children start shifting into a new way of thinking. They go, oh, wait a moment. So for every one that I go up here, I go 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2. And before we know it, they are languaging their perceptuomotor activity in ways that are now in the mathematical discourse, the disciplinary language. So this is what I mean by they first learned a new perceptuomotor capacity, and they focused on particular parts of that. And then once they were able to articulate it, they shift into the mathematical discourse. So we are first creating a new perceptuomotor capacity, which then prospectively will ground the mathematical language, which now has meaning. So if you think back to all those people hoping that there's meaning just shifting at superficially between graphs and tables, now there is meaning, because now when the kids generate these kinds of tables, they are referring to the perceptuomotor capacity that they have developed. So it's grounded. I worked with collaborators at Utrecht University to do eye tracking on this. And now what we see here, and this is your chance to experience an attentional anchor, we've taken the same kind of idea. After that, we worked with many more concepts, but let's just stay within proportion for a second. And instead of that being 2 parallel lines, there'll be this is still vertical. This one will move sideways, so that now it will be green when your finger is, say, at 10 centimeters up here, and this finger is at 20 centimeters across there. And this is with eye tracking. So we're looking to see where the kid is observing. And the kid is trying to make the screen green, looking at the left finger, looking at the right finger. And notice that there's nothing here, no stimuli, no contours at all.
Hallo? Ja, die had je net al. Maar je kan ook allebei je vingers bewegen op zich.
So this child is trying to make green, and occasionally green will pop up. But just like with the earlier studies, just like with these kids, it's really difficult to coordinate. We're asking kids to do what seems to be the impossible, moving your hands simultaneously, orthogonally, proportionately. Why don't you try this at home, right? There's that quip, don't try this at home, kids. Well, I'm asking you, kids, do try this at home. Why don't you try now? So move your, I guess, left hand. I'm sorry, I might be mirrored here. So left hand is like along the y-axis, right hand along the x-axis. Try to move your hands simultaneously, orthogonally, proportionately. Yes, also you and you who are not trying. Try this at home now. Yes, you too, sir. Thank you. Try this now. Moving your hands simultaneously, orthogonally, proportionately. People tell us this is very difficult, and the kids also found it initially difficult. But then what we see, to our great astonishment, children, very young children, age 9, 10, 11, in vocational schools will say to us
Is dan deze ook verder weg?
things like this.
Ja, wel iets, maar het blijft wel zeg maar op één lijn zo.
Blijf wel.
It has to remain in line. Okay, what line in the world is this child speaking about when the child gestures this way? It turns out that what many kids, and there were multiple ways of doing it, kids were starting to look at a diagonal line connecting their fingers. So when I say diagonal line, let me just bring this up here.
Dus bij het begin beginnen.
Kids are envisaging in their imagination a diagonal line that is connecting between their fingers. The moment you imagine a diagonal line connecting between your fingers, you now no longer need to move your hands in any old way, this one and that one. Now suddenly this new attentional anchor, this thing pops up, and this thing is now enabling you to coordinate what seemed impossible by manual coordination. You now have this new attentional anchor, this new structure, the diagonal line emerges in the child's orientation towards the environment as a perceptual solution to the sensorimotor problem of coordinating the co-enactment of two independent movements. And we had all kinds of testimonies. Other children are talking, say that they looked at this point over here, the sort of the Cartesian point, so that they were looking, so to speak, to open the rectangle this way. Many different ways of doing this. And then we bring in the grid, etc., and they're able to kind of shift into the mathematical language. But what's critical for us is that they were first able to develop a new perceptual motor capacity. Now, is this particular line the best way to introduce proportional reasoning? Maybe yes, maybe no. Certainly there are other ways, and kids came up with other ways, and depending on the activity, different kinds of ways will emerge. And proportion, like any other mathematical, say, symbol, is polysemous. It has multiple meanings. But my point here is to demonstrate the principle that you can develop new perceptual motor capacities prior to grounding them then in symbols. And so I come back to our baseball player. And if earlier we remonstrated, well, where's the math? I would like to propose that what we are seeing here, just like this outfielder is able to catch a ball by developing this new perceptual motor capacity, which seems to be shared by all mammals, certainly birds of prey. So what we have created here is a new perceptual motor capacity under the controlled conditions and through this empirical work with the children who start looking here where there's no contour, no stimulus, nothing at all. They spontaneously create a new perceptual motor capacity that then they use as they start thinking mathematically. You can read more about it over here. I realize we're coming towards the end of our time here. Things that I could also speak about, people typically ask me about are, well, you know, how does this work with teachers? I have videos on that. People ask, well, it's all very well to wave the hands in the air, but, you know, how does it look when they're actually, you know, doing paper math? And so I have demonstrations of that. And other things I might talk about is recurrent quantification analysis, where a dynamic systems theory take on how this is actually working, how these new capacities emerge and in ways that are reminiscent of systems in phase transition. What other symbols, what other concepts are we working on through to college with our friends in Utrecht? What platforms this is available on, like this is a free download, and what about people with different sensorimotor capacities? So we have all kinds of activities for blind students that we've been developing with Colorado and SLU. I could also speak about work, artificial intelligence work with Avatar, and artificially intelligent virtual teacher, and etc. But I think at this point, what I'll do is maybe just have one conclusion slide here. So mathematical concepts are grounded in stabilized sensorimotor patterns that emerge as practical solutions for perceptually coordinating the enactment of ecologically coupled movements. Sociocultural reframing of these attentional anchors may occur through timely mediation of speech, gesture, and symbolic artifacts. Students adopt these new resources spontaneously as readily available means of enhancing their goal-oriented actions, yet in so doing, they appropriate heritage conceptual systems that enable them to participate in the social enactment of mathematical practice. And educational designers can engineer and facilitate this process. We have the theory, the technology, the frameworks and methods. So let's do it. And maybe I'll just end with this. The brain is not a computer. It does not process abstract symbols or propositions. The act of thinking mobilizes the same sensorimotor modalities by which we function in the natural and sociocultural environment. How we think, therefore, depends on how we know to move in the world, how we know to operate on various objects, what tools we have mastered, what languages we speak. As such, educators can affect students' cognitive development by shaping their sensorimotor experiences with dedicated objects. So, thank you. So, Stefan, I guess this is where we open it up. Sorry, Stefan, you're muted, so I missed the pearls of wisdom. I'm seeing familiar faces. I'm finally looking at the gallery. Hi, Art. Hi, Stephen.
This is going to produce echoes. Can you unshare your screen and just show the faces? Okay, good. Now, excuse me for the echo. I don't know why it's happening, actually. If I turn this off, you won't hear me. And I don't know what's happening on the other side. Can you tolerate the echo just long enough so that I can?
Yes. What sometimes happens is if one of the other people in the room has their mic on, we'll have this. If there's anyone else in your room, you should ask them to mute themselves.
That's muted. No. Okay, one second. One second.
Étienne, tu dois fermer le son de ton ordinateur et ouvrir le son de la salle.
Okay, now it should. Thank you. Terrific. Can you hear?
Yeah, merci bien. Yeah, c'est mieux.
Thank you for everybody, and apologies for my technological imbecility. Okay, Art, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you, Dor. That really is a great talk. I was taking notes during the talk just to sort of get, some of the words down that you were using. I'm sure I've read them before, but hearing them from you made them more real. So thank you very much. I did want to bring to your attention and perhaps other people's attention a paper. I put it in the, so I put it in the chat. So there's the email of Leonardo Fernandino, who was one of the authors of a paper called How Does the Default Mode Network Contribute to Semantic Cognition? And the reason I'm putting it in here relative to your talk is because this paper changed my understanding. Whereas, I've always said that cognition, is based on sensory motor and emotional cortices and reusing those cortices and simulating, using the visual system and the action system and so on and so forth. And this paper builds on that. And, it shows that those modal systems are absolutely necessary for cognition, but then goes on to show how other areas of cortex, namely the default mode network, controls those sensory motor areas. and provides the ability to combine across those sensory motor areas to create a dynamic mental model, a dynamic situation model. And so it's just a really nice putting together of ideas that are very much grounded in sensory motor system, but then brings in the rest of the brain. Whether it's right or wrong, I don't know. I found it to be pretty convincing, but just sort of his idea of how to bring in the rest of the brain along with modal cognition. I just found that to be really interesting. So that's one. If I can continue, then I do have a bit of a question for you.
Art,
yes.
Can I just quickly react to that one? I promise to bring it back to you.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've been very much interested in the work of Gibson, but sort of the other, or the part, Eleanor Gibson, who speaks about what she calls the like intermodality. And I'm still unraveling that. So many of us have sort of grown up on J.J. Gibson, but Eleanor Gibson speaks about this underlying cognitive substrate that's enabling activity in different sensory motor modalities to resonate or to be coordinated. And it just sounds to me that related to this, even if it's from an ecological psychology take, what we found fascinating is people's like phenomenology of let's call it magnitudes, such as intensity. Like in my work with probability, when people say, this is kind of building on Gerd Gigeren's as well, like, oh, it feels to me, this feels more likely than that. What is this feeling? Because the feeling is it's not just perceptual judgment. It's now that you've made, it's like you carry this feeling, oh yes, this is more likely. And then I give them the various symbols and diagrams, and then they glom onto those and say, oh yes, the distribution, that is why. But this feeling of intensity feels like it's not any particular, it feels very modal. And yet, it's kind of a somatic, like, where does one put it? It's not any clear, such that it is able then to ground any kind of diagram. So that's my feeling when you talked about this work from Fernando, that the sense of something underlying that is enabling to go across the modalities. Because if you don't have that substrate, how is it that we're going among the different modalities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of connections between this Fernandino paper and what you just talked about, and so I just recommend it to people. I'm not giving a reference because it's actually under review. And so that's why I gave his email address, so you can write to him and ask for a copy of the paper.
Thank you.
I found that generally he's very generous, in sending things out like this. But here's the question for you, and it's almost not fair because you just mentioned this in passing, but I wanted to stick it to you. It was, you were talking about grounding in, sensory motor and phenomenological experience. And well, I thought as soon as you mentioned phenomenological, you are going down a slippery slope, because we don't know. I mean, really, that's just about the same as saying conscious experience. And we don't know what consciousness is.
Okay.
I don't know how to ground consciousness. So if that's important to you, please give me an answer. If it was just a throwaway, you can just say that too.
Okay. So being I guess, disciple of sorts of Varela, and I should say that I came to these ideas long before I'd heard about any of these people. It was more like, being a poet and you don't know it. It's only later that I found all this work and I thought, yeah, this makes sense, this, and okay. It was a bit more like a design framework in search of a theory, right? And enactivism appeals to me, and I've collaborated with Dan Hutto, we've co-authored things together. Varela's paradigm or program in neurophenomenology is one that looks to triangulate between first-person testimonies of cognitive experience with, multimodal learning analytics, EEGs, and what have yous that cognitive neuroscientists are using in order ostensibly to capture, measure, gauge the same activity. So that's Varela's program, and his student Claire Petit-Mangin came up with an instrument that she developed that's called the micro-phenomenological interview, which looks to draw from people these kind of just under the surface phenomenological experiences, trying to get at this raw, at the kind of things that Maurice Merleau-Ponty is speaking about, just under the radar of consciousness. Now, of course, we bring in these metaphysical or what have you words, consciousness and phenomenology, and the more hard-boiled cognitive science just shriek or to switch off the Zoom. That's it. He said the P word, phenomenology, right? But we ourselves have these experiences. When we do the recurrent quantification analysis of students coming to see and move things in new way, we can literally predict. Well, it's not predict. What's that funny word? Post-dict, right? Because it's in our data, and the kid has already left the lab. But we can see a few seconds before. We can see, okay, the phase transition is coming. And then the child is kind of talking about, oh, yeah, okay, here we are. So we can try and get through both first-person testimonies and through eye tracking and action logging and RQA and other computational analyses. We can try to get to triangulate these experiences. We have children doing things, talking, gesturing, and we just find it fascinating that I like the work of Merlin Donald, who speaks about the way, like 100,000 years ago, or what our brain changed so that now we can reflect on our action. This child who suddenly talks about this diagonal line, who knows? This is like a huge question for me. If you don't ask a child, how are you doing this? Will they become conscious of it? And the moment you ask them, then they say, oh, yes, the line. And you might say, oh, they knew it all the time. No, it's this kind of Heisenberg answer. It's by virtue of asking the child that he kind of clicks in and says, oh, yes, the line. It's this very interesting kind of Tomasello moment of joint attention where you start talking about things and people talk about their thinking. So all this to say that the phenomenological substance is there. It's there, and we language it, and then we're kind of outside of it. It's like the body snatchers. We suddenly find ourselves outside of that, but we can refer to it. So these are huge questions, Art, and thanks for asking me. But we're still working on it, and in the lab, there's, for instance, my student Julien Put from Luxembourg is working just on these issues. He's interviewing people who are engaging diagrammatic reasoning. They're looking at a very interesting class of mathematical proofs called proofs without words. I'm sure you've seen these classical kind of Pythagorean theorems where you look and suddenly go, okay, I get it. There's not a single word there. It's just pictures, and you look through, and he's eye tracking where they're looking, and then they go, oh yes. Okay, so trying to get at what is going on before that aha moment through this microphonological interview. But yes, I'm talking a lot, and Stefan, are there more questions?
Yes. In fact,
I'm going to continue on this another time, but right, I'd like to hear what other people have to say also. Thank you.
I thought your talk was wonderful, Dor.
Thank you.
Even better than I expected. And I have some questions, and they're not critical questions, they're inquiring questions. First of all, to art, we don't have to fall into the pit of the hard problem if we and taking on phenomenology. The motor part, have faith in the motor part. It's enough. Motor is already there. And so I have a question about that, and I have a question that will bring it into the ChatGPT LLM question as well. You work with mathematical concepts in children and ways of in using them, and they're clearly sensory motor. I mean, visual motor or tactile motor, and it's making a connection in that case, grounding, if you like, between the words that we use to describe these mathematical relations formally and stuff that the kids can actually do and see. And phenomenology is, yes, it feels like something to keep those things in line, but it's already something to be doing what it takes to keep them in line. So you don't have to get caught on the horns of explaining how it is that we feel anything at all. But let me say that you are basing on a terrific subject matter, mathematical concepts, but there's a lot of other things to be grounded in the world besides mathematical concepts. I wonder how this scales up, for example, to a purely visual, not a sensory motor, but a visual invariant. It's still a sensory motor problem, because if you show somebody patterns which have certain visual, not geometrical, but just visual color relations and things like that, invariants, features that distinguish one kind of thing from another kind of thing. Once they get it, that there's two kinds of things there or three kinds of things there, there's still a motor component because they did it by trial and error. They had to do something to figure out what it was. But how does motor have to be to produce the sensory?
So I just put in the chat a paper that it just so happened this very week we hosted Alessandra Buchela, works with Tony Chimera, to talk about this very issue. So I just have it handy here. I have a weekly group. We meet every Tuesday. We're called the Embodied Underground, and we talk about papers related to embodiment. And it's an international sort of Zoom base, and we always have the author join us. And so she is talking about taking ecological psychology-ish take on what perceptual constancies are. And if I understood the paper correctly, even when we are looking at static images, she has there a picture, she shows a picture of this classical kind of Italian, you're walking down some kind of via, right? And you look into the vanishing point of this rural bucolic scenery with cypress trees. As you go look further in, they kind of appear smaller. I think you know, with some kind of castle on the and she asks, like, how is it that we know that the trees aren't really getting smaller, but and so even implicit to what you might think is a static moment is, ecological psychology will say, is the sense of affordance. Now you could say, well, the scenery isn't moving, so what's motor about static? Well, according to Enactivist, every moment perception is necessarily perception for action, because that is how we are neurally and evolutionarily oriented. That is our brain's fundamental architecture is always perceiving for action. What we care about is to move. We want to move towards or away from environmental resources, a friend or fiend. And so even then, when we look at something static, it's in order to grasp it. When you look at a baseball, it's in order to grasp.
You're right, but you chose constancy, which is it's a hybrid phenomenon, right? That there's an implicit motor movement component to anything that involves a constancy effect. I said something more general. I said just visual patterns, just static visual patterns. And I'll give you an example. I use an example that I use all the time in my course. Mushrooms, okay? You're on an island and there are mushrooms of all kinds. You're alone. You can't eat anything else. You don't know which ones are edible and which ones aren't. You have to figure it out. And so it's inactive. You have to taste them and you have to get a little sick and throw up and sometimes nourished until finally you know which ones are which. But the which is an invariance, but it's not an invariance like a constancy. It's simply a feature of mushrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And
so,
I want to, yeah, go ahead.
So the fungi, right? When we talk about features, we need to, it's like the slippery slope. We suddenly go into this other kind of descriptive, definitional language where we actually, it's metaphysically, we're going into a different kind of realm, a different kind of discourse where we speak about definitions. This is what the mushroom is. It has these features and such. And of course, that's how we have to speak as humans, as scientists, as anything. You know, you go to the shop, there are those things that are such and such. We speak about features of the environment as being there, as being inherent to substances. And that's how we communicate knowledge. And that language is amazing that we can do that. At the end of the day, if you ask, well, what is the brain such that I can even make sense of your words just now when you talk about mushrooms? Well, you talk about the island, etc. So I was evoking an island and then that mushroom, and thinking of art's work, right? There's the mushroom, underneath there's the island, and over there there's, so all of these, right? I'm interpreting your language by building this image to make sense.
That's not the question. That's not the question. You are on the island. You are on the island.
Yes,
nobody's telling you anything. Nobody's saying anything about words. You've never seen these mushrooms before. You just have to survive, okay? And you learn, it's inactive, you learn by trial and error which ones are edible and which ones aren't.
Yes.
That's all.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, what you learned there is not like what your kids are learning in mathematics. It's not this kind of an invariance. It's simply, it is an invariance. It's an invariance in the pattern domain. I'm not speaking against your symbol grounding approach. I'm trying to generalize it to something that gets us back to ChatGPT, which is ChatGPT. The question you would ask if you say that LLMs are not grounded, the question is how much they have to have some sensorimotor stuff to ground. How much? What is one modality? And simply the motor action of doing the right thing or the wrong thing, is that enough? Does it really have to be geometric the way you described it?
So I'll need to give more thought on how these ideas expand out of my bailiwick of mathematics to other realms of knowledge, and I would look to speak about the whole somatic and gustatory sense of this mycological experience, and how we then relate the taste and smell and sight to what it evokes within us, attraction or repulsion, in reaction to the sight of that. I just want to say that I see there's another hand up by Mario.
Go ahead,
and
Mario,
it could be that he wants to speak about mushrooms. Are you also a fun guy?
Hello.
Yes, hi. Sorry, yes, very nice talk, but I have few comments. For example, like one of my comments at the end, you say mathematical concepts. In the conclusion, you say mathematical concepts are grounded in stabilized sensorimotor patterns, but maybe only basic mathematical concepts, because in mathematics there are like other concepts that are really abstract and you cannot maybe ground them. And it's not only about representation. For example, what about the proof itself, which is purely not may be grounded. Or I give you some examples. For example, how can you explain to a child, for example, transcendental numbers like pi and Euler constant E, which like it will never end, infinitely creating numbers and numbers and digits with no pattern, for example, or imaginary numbers.
Okay, so first of all, it just so happens that in their book Where Mathematics Comes From by George Lakoff and Rafael Núñez, they treated specifically the Euler theorem of e to the pi I minus 1 equals 0, and taking us through this epic voyage of how all of this is actually grounded. Now, epistemologically, I don't necessarily agree with the cognitive semantics theory of conceptual metaphor, Lakoff and Johnson. I mean, they did amazing work in like blazing the trails for the embodiment, but I have my differences with them. But just I thought I'd mention, because they have like a huge chunk of speaking about that, or if you want a shorter version, there's a 1999 paper by Núñez and others. It so happens that a visiting scholar in my lab now from Turkey, Fatih Muhammad Dugan, is working on the embodiment of proof. So we're just starting to think about that as well. But I should say that this very idea of the abstract, as I like to say, abstract and abstractness, that's the A word. We're not allowed to say it in our lab. Whenever you say abstract, you have to put a penny in the pizza box. What do we actually mean by abstract? Now, of course, I'm playing this game here with you. Like colloquially, we all use it all the time, and we know kind of what we mean. But when we're more careful with it, we realize that we usually use the term abstract, and here I'm citing my mentor, Uri Wilensky. We use abstractness is not an inherent property of an idea or symbol or anything. It's more about my subjective relationship to the idea. When I know something, like I've studied the binomial theorem so much for a whole project, I built my tenure on that, to the point that it's completely concrete for me. It's these marbles that I put like that. But then you show me some other formula, and I'll just wait. What? Whoa! That just feels so abstract, but abstract to me. So my proposal is to think of abstractness not as inherent to an idea, but something that hasn't yet been grounded. Now, when people ask me things about, what about infinity? What about this? Like, right, they're bringing out all the Lakatosian monsters, right? With that Erdish, all the monsters, right? What?
Not really, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. But even like just infinity, so I can refer to the work of Brian Rotman, who talks about how is it that we perceive infinity by it's like this, each time it's this little guy that thinks that another guy moving forward. It's like an extrapolation of our capacity to move, for example, along some line. So all this to say that we are conquering more and more grounds with this approach.
Yes, I agree. Yes, I agree with you on a lot of stuff. Yes, I agree with you on a lot of stuff. But I think always there will remain some abstraction, and it is required for mathematics. This is what I think. But
okay, so you owe me a penny in the box for the next time we have pizza together.
Yes, no
but let's keep this conversation going. Thank you, Mario. Thank you for that
This
question.
passes to Jean-Guy Meunier. Go ahead.
Sorry, would you kindly repeat?
Your microphone is too quiet. Your microphone is too quiet.
Do you understand? Do you hear me?
Still quiet.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation. It makes clear the difference between embodiment and action. One question I would like to ask is, during your presentation, you're talking about meaning. And often when your presentation is presenting your results, you pass to the word understanding. There's a slight difference between these two things. I can see that by your embodiment, by your enaction, you can ground symbols you are working with. But when you start combining symbols on one with the plus and so on and equals, you're not at the level of words or atomic symbols. You're at you're at the levels of formulas and at the level of propositions. And the understanding of the meaning of a word and the understanding the meaning of a proposition is not the same thing. The problem of where do you slide between enactment at the level of the symbols, where you're at the level of propositions. There are propositions that are so complex that I have difficulty seeing that even if you can ground your symbols in this formula, it's not easy when you're going at very complex symbols, which they ask for an intuition, which is much closer to understanding than just finding the meaning of the symbols themselves. Do you see the difficulty?
I do. Thank you for that question, Jean-Guy. We use these various words, again, colloquially, like meaning and understanding, because they're useful for us in our everyday discourse. And when we come to try and make sense of them more formally, we sometimes realize that the particular colloquial words don't necessarily obtain within the scientific paradigm, within the models of human thinking. So that even as we have our everyday discourse, maybe we need to use other words when we do the analyses. Now, this question of propositions becoming more and more complex seems to me very analogous to just questions of basic literacy, where you learn letters and then you can read phonemes, and maybe you learn whole words, but then there are new words, and then there are other words that go together and make sentences. And yet when we read text, when you read a novel, you forget that you're in those word level, you're in this ideational, imagistic place that moves you. So you're no longer at the level of those symbols, but rather you have rehearsed your literacy to the level that it becomes completely transparent to you. You're no longer dealing with words, like when you're playing the piano, you're not dealing with, or like, so when you speak about ideas or understanding becoming more complex, I would think, well, again, this is very relative. And you started out by the question of like 1 plus, etc. Yes, when you're just learning that for the very first time, this thing and then that and that is demanding of you. But then you can make sense of it, because it evokes for you some things that you can talk about, refer to, think with. You can, of course, distribute over your body and over other semiotic resources in order to make sense of these things, so that at every level we're always on the verge of a new understanding. I absolutely agree with you about this sense of intuiting when you almost get it, or tip of the tongue. It's fascinating that we have this capacity to reflect on our own cognitive processes and feel that they are going towards something, that idea, just like we're trying to remember a name of some person. It's like, well, I always have it. So we can do that. So understanding would be the achievement of grounding the meaning of propositions in something that is coherent enough for me to feel I have a grip on it. I understand it. It is now being encapsulated as a new structure. We're always building structures upon structure, networks in networks. Of course, all of these words that we use, building, network, structures, they're all metaphors in a sense that we're trying to refer to neural processes here. And again, that's where our language maybe comes short of referring to what is actually going on there neurally. But I see substance to work that is indicating how symbols come to have meanings, and researching, studying in real time what it is that people are doing in order to have and share these meanings, how people in conversation, what are the ethnomethods that they engage in order to make their actions and utterances mutually intelligible. It all starts from that. It starts from our capacity to coordinate our action through joint attention so that we can distribute the co-enactment of, hunting or whatever, gathering, whatever it is that our foreparents did. Yeah.
Comment on that. That in philosophy or philosophy of science, the concept of understanding cannot just be the reactions to the grounding. Concept of understanding implies that you're also using your background knowledge. You're integrating what you have with not just the motor experience of the world you have. You need some other types of knowledge. And this implies another type of cognitive process. Reading a book is not just combining the words. You need a background, and this background is something. It's the depot of your own experience, yes, your motor experience, but also it's the depot of your social, your cultural background, and there's where intuitions will come in. Intuition will not be just a flash. It's the capacity that you have to integrate, so that this complex formula for a mathematician suddenly opens up to something else. That's understanding.
I'm sorry if I'm interrupting, because I'm also conscious of the time and I have another meeting coming up. But just to say, I completely agree with you that we incorporate cultural forms, epistemic forms, and others in order to organize as cultural resources that we appropriate. And this is more of Vygotskian perspective, as cultural resources that we appropriate in order to organize our thinking. And it's thus that we evolve within a biological cultural niche, right, where we become evolutionarily more adapted to appropriate these cultural forms in order to organize and distribute our cognitive activity. And of course, it's opening up more and more. And so I appreciate that comment, but I just want to be also conscious of the time and bring it back to Stefan. Stefan, you're muted right now.
I'm muted again?
Oh, no. Okay, sorry. You're fine. Your icon shows that you're muted, but my ears deceive me.
Okay. I wanted to thank you again. It was too short and it ended too fast. We're going to have a summer institute here on much the same topic, LLMs and grounding here. And I will want to invite you again because you haven't said nearly enough. And Art too, Art Glenberg. Thank you, everybody. Steve, I want to ask you a question. Why didn't you jump in on when Dor mentioned likelihood? Why didn't you jump in with Larry Maloney's finding on ChatGPT?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Are you talking to me?
Yes, I am.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. I was enjoying the talk and the conversation. I thought it was a very good talk. I think there's some interesting problems here, but you're asking about Larry's results.
The specific question is this: Dor mentioned, repeat what you said about intensity and likelihood. Because
yes, I was referring to work of Eleanor Roche and this idea of, sorry, not Eleanor Roche, I got my Eleanor's wrong, Eleanor Gibson. Too many Eleanors, too little time. And the idea of intermodality and asking myself, what is it that we're talking about when we have the sense of intensity? I'm looking at a certain situation that has probabilistic prospective outcomes, and I sense the likelihood of some particular event, maybe a compound event.
Okay, you did it. You said it. Now, in the interest of time, Steve, do you get it? I'm talking about Larry Maloney's findings.
Yeah, well,
ChatGPT's judgment.
I hesitate to talk about Larry's work because it's unpublished, but they did a simple task and gave it to humans and ChatGPT. So the long and short of it, they picked something like 20 to 30 different uncertainty terms, sort of probabilistic terms and so on. And what they found is incredibly high correlation, 0.95, 0.96, between this exact same task and the human's understanding of their uncertainty terms and ChatGPT-4's understanding of its uncertainty terms. Now, how do humans learn this, and how did ChatGPT, for God's sakes, learn this? It's a very interesting problem in that grounding of these kinds of uncertainties are not obvious. I mean, there's a famous equation due to JBS Haldane, which is a second-order differential equation, a heat equation, and students are asking, well, professor, what does this mean? And he says, for a while, and he looks at them, he says, it oozes. It's oozing. And of course, they immediately understood the second-order differential equation. Now, this means that this problem has grounding in multiple different structures, and I think there's not a single kind of approach here that will be satisfactory. I think the default mode network kinds of ideas that were brought up by, I think, one of the questioners is interesting. I actually work with default mode network and resting state, and I run an imaging center. So these are things we worry about. I haven't quite heard this hypothesis, partly because it's really hard to make the claims that they may be making, but I'm speaking more from a scientific point of view rather than, metaphorical point of view about what these structures are. But I don't know if that did what you wanted, Stephen, but I'm here.
Whether it did or didn't, I'm afraid we're going to have to put an end to it. Fine.
Good.
Thanks very much to all of you. And Dor, if you get a chance, you should drop in on some of the other seminars because they're pertinent, I think, to your work.
Okay. So thank you very much. And is it QCNM?
Right? Yes.
BK.
BK is peace. Very good.